All right, buckle up, because we're diving deep today. You sent in some really interesting stuff, a keynote speech by George Yeo about the future of, well, China and Europe. And I think most people know him as the former foreign minister of Singapore.
Yeah, 23 years in government.
Exactly. But now he's this big voice in business and in academia, too, which gives him a really interesting perspective to draw from.
It's really interesting how he brings it all together. You know, it's not just a bunch of facts in his speech. It's like a whole way of looking at the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we're not just going to be talking about, like, China's economy or military, those typical things. We're going to be exploring how their history, going way back, shapes how they act now and their ambitions for the future. He makes some surprising connections, too.
Oh, like what?
Well, he even links the invention of paper to the European Renaissance. I mean, who would have thought? It'll definitely make you think differently about some things.
I'm intrigued. One thing that really stood out to me was how he tackled China's response to COVID. You know, a lot of the Western media was super focused on those lockdowns and everything.
Right.
But Yeo actually argues that they did a good job overall.
Yeah, he cites all this data from the WHO, the World Health Organization, showing that their death rate was one of the lowest per capita. And I don't know if you remember, but remember all those boxes we were getting?
Oh, yeah.
The made in China boxes? I mean, those were showing up on our doorsteps while, like, most of the world was shut down. Yeo uses that as a very real example of how China's economy kept going strong, and it gave them this huge advantage.
But it's more than logistics. Yeo actually points out that China has been dealing with pandemics for centuries, going way, way back. They were really meticulous about documenting everything.
Yeah.
Symptoms, treatments, even quarantine procedures for their imperial palaces.
Like they had a plan ready to go, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like a playbook.
While other countries were scrambling, they were using centuries of experience to get through it.
And that really challenges the common narrative that, you know, it was all just about authoritarian control. From China's perspective, they were using their historical knowledge to protect their people and their economy.
So that's the pandemic.
Yeah.
But then Yeo goes even further back, like way back,
Yeah.
to look at the roots of Chinese civilization itself. He argues that their cultural and political continuity is just unparalleled, especially if you compare it to, say, ancient Rome.
And he has that fascinating comparison about paper and parchment.
Oh, right.
So for centuries, China basically had this monopoly on making paper, and that allowed them to record and preserve knowledge on a massive scale. Yeo suggests that this actually contributed to how deep and rich their history and cultural memory is.
He even says that a high schooler in China today can read texts from 2,000 years ago. I mean, it's crazy.
Imagine.
Right. Can you imagine trying to do that with ancient Latin or Greek? No way.
Exactly. And that's Yeo's point. This deep connection to their past isn't just some academic thing. It shapes how they see their place in the world, how they approach diplomacy, even their economic policies. It's about playing the long game, which I think is a really hard concept for the West to grasp sometimes.
Now, here's where things get really interesting. Yeo compares China's leaders to, like, a communist priesthood, governing through these pronouncements that are really rooted in their history. He even mentions Mao Zedong's annotations on ancient dynastic histories.
It's such a striking image.
Isn't it?
It really highlights how hard it is to understand what motivates China. They see themselves as like carrying on this massive historical legacy, and it really, really influences their decisions and actions.
It's almost like, you know, when you're trying to understand a move in chess, but you don't even know the rules of the game, you might see aggression or ambition, but you're totally missing the context, the deeper historical and cultural context.
Absolutely. And that leads us right into Yeo's critique of how the West often gets China wrong, especially with sensitive topics like Taiwan.
Right. He brings up the example of that G7 statement.
Oh, right.
The one that triggered such a strong reaction in China. Yeo argues that it basically presented this view of their country that was just totally at odds with how they see themselves.
It's really important to point out that he's not, like, just defending China?
No, not at all.
What he's really advocating for is this genuine chemistry between Europe and China. A relationship built on mutual understanding and respect, not just strategy.
He's saying, hey, if you actually want to work with China, you have to meet them on their level. And that means understanding their history, their culture, their entire worldview.
It's a call for a more nuanced approach to diplomacy, one that recognizes just how complex different cultural perspectives are and the need for empathy in international relations.
And on that note of complexity, let's talk about Taiwan. Yeo analyzes it as this potential flashpoint for conflict, but he also highlights the possibility of a peaceful resolution. He actually shares this personal anecdote about Xi Jinping and Ma Ying-jeou's meeting back in 2015, which kind of suggested they were willing to find some common ground.
Oh, interesting. But he's clear about the red lines, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Liz, what's off limits?
He warns that any attempt by Western powers to use the Taiwan card to put pressure on China is incredibly dangerous. It's like playing with fire because you're messing with something that is deeply, deeply rooted in China's sense of self. For those who might not be familiar, the Taiwan card is basically the strategy of using Taiwan's status to influence what China does. This could mean strengthening ties with Taiwan, giving them military support, or even suggesting that Taiwan should be a separate country.
Right.
But Yeo emphasizes that for China, Taiwan isn't just some geopolitical thing. It's about historical justice, a wound that hasn't healed. They see Taiwan as this territory that was unjustly taken from them, and they're determined to get it back to reunite.
And he really makes it clear that this isn't something any Chinese leader could back down from, no matter how powerful they are. They would lose the support of their people.
It's deeply emotional, interwoven with their national identity and their pride and their history.
And that raises a really crucial question for Europe. Yeo asks, what if the U.S. turns inward? Can the EU stand on its own 2 feet? Do they have the vision, the willpower, and even the capacity to be truly independent on the world stage?
It's a real challenge. He's basically saying Europe needs to get a much deeper understanding of China to navigate this world where power is spread out, more multipolar. Especially on things like Taiwan, where Europe's interests might not be the same as the U.S.'s.
And he sees places like the School of Transnational Governance as being really key to fostering that understanding.
Yeah.
It's about building bridges, creating dialogue, promoting a more nuanced view of China, not just within governments, but throughout society.
It's about preparing the next generation of leaders with the knowledge and skills to navigate this increasingly complex world, really.
This is where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore what Yeo's message really means for Europe, for the world, and, yeah, for you. So, picking up where we left off, I think it's really important to point out that Yeo doesn't just shy away from critiquing China, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
He acknowledges how assertive they've been, especially in the South China Sea, and how much anxiety that creates for their neighbors. He doesn't sugarcoat it.
And he definitely doesn't let the West off the hook either.
No, not at all.
Yeo calls out what he sees as hypocrisy. You know, like Western powers criticizing China's human rights record, but kind of forgetting about their own colonial past and what they're doing in the world today.
It's really refreshing how he avoids those simple narratives, you know, those good guy, bad guy tropes. He pushes us to recognize that powerful nations throughout history have acted in their own interests. And those actions, well, they haven't always been pretty. The question is, how do we navigate this world where power is more spread out, more, what did he call it?
Octipolar.
Right, multipolar.
He uses the analogy of a world with multiple poles, like the U.S., China, Europe, all vying for influence.
Right.
And he sees that as inevitable, maybe even positive if we handle it right. But he throws down a challenge, especially to Europe. Step up and develop a more independent foreign policy.
It all comes back to what he was saying about the dangers of just following the U.S., especially when it comes to Taiwan. Yeo argues that Europe has its own interests, and those interests mean engaging directly with China, building understanding and trust.
He even suggests that a strong, independent Europe could actually be a stabilizing force in the world, like a balance between the U.S. and China, helping to prevent conflict.
It's a key point because it challenges that common idea that Europe is just a pawn in this U.S.-China rivalry.
Right.
Yeo sees Europe as this potential power player, capable of shaping the future of global order on its own.
But he's realistic about the challenges. He acknowledges those deep historical and cultural ties between Europe and the U.S., you know, the ties that really influence how Europe makes decisions, especially about security. It's not easy to just break away from that.
Yeah. And then there are the internal divisions within Europe, too.
Right.
All those national interests and perspectives that make it so hard for them to agree and speak with one voice on the world stage.
So he sees the obstacles. But Yeo is still optimistic about Europe's potential to play a more constructive role. He really urges European leaders to actually invest in understanding China, in engaging with their culture, their history, even their way of seeing the world. It's not just about economics or politics, it's about perspective.
And he sees those institutions, like that School of Transnational Governance, as vital to this whole process, fostering a new generation of leaders who can bridge the cultural divide and build that genuine chemistry between Europe and China that we were talking about.
And it's not just about diplomats in fancy rooms either.
No, exactly.
Yeo emphasizes how important those people-to-people exchanges are, cultural collaborations, business partnerships. He's calling for something that goes way beyond the traditional halls of power.
It's about recognizing that the future won't just be shaped by governments. It'll be shaped by businesses, by civil society, even by individuals connecting with each other and building understanding.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener? Yeo doesn't give us a simple answer, a 5-step plan, or anything like that, but he does give us a really powerful way of thinking about the future. He challenges us to move beyond the headlines, to look past our own limited viewpoints, and to try and understand the motivations and the anxieties of all the major players in the world.
He's urging us to really engage with how complex and quickly the world is changing, and to recognize that we all have a role to play in shaping it, no matter who we are or what we do.
He's asking us to be active participants, not just watching from the sidelines, to help build those bridges of understanding and cooperation that we need for a peaceful and prosperous 21st century.
And it starts with understanding that understanding is the foundation of trust. We can't address these global challenges if we're coming from a place of ignorance or fear.
He's reminding us that talking to each other is essential, even when it's hard, even when we disagree. Because through those tough conversations, that's how we can start to find common ground and build a future that works for everyone.
Now, Yeo's speech focuses on China and Europe, but I think his ideas are much bigger than that. They're about how power and influence work in the 21st century. I mean, think about it. How many conflicts, big or small, stem from just not understanding each other?
It's true.
He shows us that history really matters. The stories countries tell themselves about who they are and their place in the world, those things really shape how they act on the global stage.
And he makes us acknowledge that it's not all just cold logic in international relations. Emotions play a huge part, deep-seated fears, national pride, historical baggage, hopes for the future. These emotional drivers often influence even the most carefully thought-out political decisions.
And he challenges us to move beyond this zero-sum way of thinking, where one country's win automatically means another one's loss.
Right.
He suggests that even between rivals, cooperation can be a really powerful force for progress and stability. He's not saying it's easy, but he is offering a possible path toward a more hopeful and collaborative future.
And that path, as we've been discussing, begins with understanding. It starts with truly listening, with open dialogue, with being willing to see the world through someone else's eyes.
It starts with you. What stands out to you from what we've talked about? What surprised you? What are you thinking about now?
We've covered so much, but Yeo doesn't leave us just hanging. I mean, he argues that China's rise, it's happening, and getting them their worldview, that's key. But what does that actually look like? Like really understanding another culture, especially one as complex as China.
Yeah, it's not about saying everything they do is okay or agreeing with all their policies, but it does start with realizing that they have their own interests, right? And this unique perspective shaped by thousands of years of history and culture.
And Yeo keeps using this term chemistry between Europe and China. But he's not talking about some political alliance or a trade deal. It's deeper than that.
Right. It's more like an intellectual and emotional connection, I guess you could say.
Yeah, exactly.
Built on respect, understanding each other, maybe even a little empathy.
But this is where it gets tough, right?
Oh, for sure.
Because it takes both sides to move past stereotypes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Europe needs to ditch that image of China as just this big communist machine, and China has to let go of the idea that Europe is just a fading power clinging to old ways.
Totally. Yeo talks about the need to really encounter the other side, to genuinely engage with their culture and how they see things. And he used this really cool example that the Jesuit missionaries who went to China way back in the 16th century, they didn't just try to force their beliefs on people.
Oh, right. I remember that.
They actually immersed themselves in Chinese culture, learned the language, studied their philosophy, even adapted their religious imagery to be more relatable to the Chinese people.
It's a great example because it shows how important it is to be sensitive to other cultures.
Yeah.
And to be willing to meet in the middle. It's not about one side dominating the other. It's about finding a common language, building that trust through real effort and respect.
Exactly.
And Yeo's argument is that this chemistry, this deeper understanding, it's crucial if we're going to deal with all the tough stuff the world's facing in the 21st century.
Are you sure?
I mean, climate change, pandemics, economic instability. These aren't problems any one country can solve on its own.
He's basically saying that we all have a shared destiny, like it or not. And the only way forward is to find ways to cooperate, to get over those divisions and work together.
And he sees Europe as having a really big role to play here. He's like, Europe, step out from behind the U.S., become more independent, develop your own vision for the future, and engage with China on your own terms.
It's a big ask. It takes courage and vision.
Absolutely.
But it's a message that goes beyond Europe. It's for all of us.
Yeo leaves us with this really powerful question, and it's one that we all have to think about in this new world. What part can you play in building that chemistry, that bridge of understanding between cultures? It might seem overwhelming, but it starts with small things.
It starts with curiosity, with questioning what we think we know, with making an effort to learn about different cultures and how other people see the world. Maybe it's reading a book, watching a documentary, or even just talking to someone from a different background.
It's about understanding that we don't just have to let the future happen to us. We can create it together. One conversation, one connection, one act of understanding at a time.
As we wrap up this deep dive into George Yeo's ideas, we hope it's given you some new things to think about, challenged some of your old assumptions, and maybe even inspired you to look at the world in a new way.
Keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep connecting, because in a world that feels more and more divided, understanding each other is more important than ever.